Samuel chapter 18 verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet the King Saul, with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands. He thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he held it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with David, but he had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him, and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success, because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he led them in their campaigns.
Thank you, Jude. That's great. And then we move on to the next chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 19, and Val is going to read some verses from that chapter for us. So we're going to have the camera on Val. Thank you.
Yes, I'm reading from verse 8, 1 Samuel 19, verse 8. Once more, war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand, while David was playing the harp. Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, he's ill. Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him. But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair.
Thank you, Jude. Thank you, Val, for our readings for today. And the story continues. The story of Saul is gradually turning into the story of David. This is classic soap opera stuff. We've got two kings, if you like. We've got King Saul, who is the older king, the king who was anointed first, who is the legal king of Israel. And then we've got David, the boy who has been anointed the next king, who is becoming a hero of the people. David's the future anointed king, and he's taking on the role of the people's champion, fighting on their behalf. And in the chapter we've missed out, the chapter we know so well, David has appeared as the champion of the people and fought against Goliath. Why have I missed that out? Because really it's Saul's story that we're continuing, we're following here. And so I thought the story of David and Goliath is so well known. I really want to carry on with this account of Saul, and we'll take for granted the fact that we know the story of David and Goliath, that when Saul couldn't fight Goliath, little David takes on Saul's armor and then says, I don't need your armor, but goes out as the champion of the people and defeats mighty Goliath. And from that point on, Saul's popularity is going down and David's popularity is going up. The future is set. David is gaining in the eyes of the people and also being equipped more by God. God is preparing the day for when David will become king. And David's also become part of the family. Saul promised his daughter, just like they do in the fairy stories. Saul promised his daughter to whoever would kill Goliath. And David does marry the daughter of Saul, this woman who's not called Michael, she's called Michal, or however you want to pronounce it. I think Val got it just about right there, Michal. And so David marries into the royal family, which, as we've seen in recent news, is not always an easy thing to do. But David becomes not only part of the royal family, but also the harpist to Saul. He becomes, we know he plays his harp, his lyre, whatever it's called in your translation of the Bible. In modern terms, it would be a guitar, I suppose. He plays his string instrument. He's part of the royal household. He also becomes close friends, and this is probably just as significant as his marriage to Saul's daughter. He becomes really, really close friends with Saul's son, Jonathan, who is, of course, the crown prince. Jonathan has not just been part of the royal household, he's led the army. He's led his own section of Saul's army in previous chapters. We've seen that. So Jonathan, this crown prince and high-ranking officer of the army, becomes a close friend with David. So David's now part of the royal court. He's married to Saul's daughter. He's close friends with Saul's son. And it says in the scriptures that whatever Saul sent David to do, David did it successfully. Great! No. Not if you are Saul. Let's look at these two men. We're going to look at Saul, then we're going to look at David, and then we're going to consider what that might mean for us in a way in which we seek to follow Christ today. Let's first look at Saul, who is, frankly, by this stage, a tyrant, a bad-tempered, self-seeking, hot-headed, moody, and conceited, power-hungry king. I'm afraid I was a bit coloured as I read these passages by a book I've been reading recently, written by a BBC correspondent about, hate to say it, but about Donald Trump. I've been reading a book about what it was like to be a journalist following Donald Trump, and how Donald Trump didn't like it when anyone else got the credit for anything that happened in America during his presidency. I know it's written by an American journalist and it was from one point of view only, so I don't want to get party political or too political about this, but it's an entertaining book and it's written as an entertaining book. But it tells us that whenever anything happened good, Donald Trump wanted to receive the glory, and anything that happened bad, someone else was to blame. And I must admit, echoes of that came into my head when I read this story. Saul becomes jealous of David. People love David. People don't love Saul. People make up a song about their king. Saul has slain thousands, hooray! But David has slain tens of thousands, oh dear. It's like a song on the football terraces. You know, football crowds sing these songs. We love our favourite player. We love our... I'm not going to mention any football teams because that'll immediately divide the audience. We love our favourite player, whether they play they play in red, or whether they play in blue or any other colour. We love our favourite team. We love our favourite player. And it's a way of taking sides. It's a way of pledging your allegiance by having your song proclaiming which champion, which player you're really in favour of. And the people were saying, Saul is good, but David, he's great. Saul wasn't happy. David was getting more glory and acclaim in the songs that the people were singing than Saul was. It's not that people were rejecting Saul. They actually seemed to support their king. But like many a tyrant, Saul didn't have the maturity or the security to accept that this young upstart was more popular than he. There's another example of someone like that in the Bible, and that's King Herod. King Herod, this is just about 1,000 years later, he behaved in exactly the same way. He killed everyone who might be rivals for his throne. Just like Saul, King Herod had fits of temper. Just like Saul, you didn't want to be around when King Herod didn't like you and the things that you did. Herod got rid of all of his rivals, including 10 of his wives and 2 of his sons. More modern kings and rulers have been like that. King Henry VIII put to death 70,000 people, including 2 of his wives. We have these nice pictures of Henry VIII, but he was one of the most tyrannical, probably the most tyrannical of all British monarchs. Kim Jong-il of North Korea confined 250,000 in what they call education camps. Idi Amin in Uganda was one of the worst of African leaders. Saul wasn't the worst of leaders, but he was jealous and ruthless and corrupt. His jealousy turned to murderous thoughts. As David played the harp to help Saul's depression, Saul twice hurled a spear at David, who managed to dodge it in time. Saul had depression, which is a condition that none of us should take lightly, but he also had within his heart jealous thoughts and murderous intent. Jesus says in Matthew 5:22, anyone who murders is subject to judgment, but I tell you, Jesus says, that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Those are harsh words, but they're words from Jesus. So we need to take them seriously and take them to heart. Not that we should be unsympathetic to those who have mental health issues, particularly those with depression. Such things need to be taken seriously, and perhaps that's what we see in Saul at this period of his life. But he was someone who, whether he was suffering with depression or not, harbored murderous thoughts: anger, jealousy, hatred, attempted murder. I'm going to suggest that we see in Saul the 5 H's, the 5-letter H's of negative thought. 5 things all begin with the letter H that are are negative thoughts, and I'm going to suggest that we need to think how much of these we harbour in ourselves. We harbour negative thoughts beginning with an H. First of all, we can harbour feelings of hurt, feelings of personal insult or injury. We harbour hurt. We all feel hurt from time to time, but rather than letting that hurt go and giving it to God and offering forgiveness in our heart, we can harbour that hurt. We can keep it close to us. We can let it stay in our hearts. We can harbour hurt in our hearts. Lots of H's here. That's the first H of negative thoughts. The second H is hostility. Hurt becomes hostility. We can harbour hostility. That hostility can become focused on one person. That hostility can lead to a need for self-preservation, maybe. We can say, for my own good, I've got to show this hostility and feel this hostility, this feeling of me against this person. It can become a setting up ourselves against someone. We can harbour not just hurt, but hostility. The third H that we can harbour is that we can harbour hate. Hate is a deep anger and animosity. It's a frighteningly strong emotion that makes us feel and say and do things that are wrong. So we can harbour hurt, which leads to hostility, which leads to hate. And then fourthly, if that gets even worse as we harbour hate, we can harbour harm. We can take action to injure someone, whether action is physical and violent, or whether it is in words, or in doing things behind someone's back, or doing things that are harming that person in their reputation. We can seek to harm people by harbouring hurt and hostility and hate. We can do harm. And the fifth H, well, that's what the Bible calls hell. Hell is alienating from God, being alienated from God by our sin and other people, which leads to our destruction. The final negative alienation is an alienation from God, total and final destruction, which the Bible calls hell. The 5 H's of negative thoughts which we can harbour: hurt, hostility, hate, harm, and hell. Lord, keep us from harbouring that hurt, so that it doesn't lead to hostility and hate, so that we will not then harm others and lead ourselves into total alienation from others and from God, which the Bible calls hell. Lord, help us not to be like Saul. Instead of denying our negative feelings, we have to face up to them and bring them to God for forgiveness and for the H that drives everything out, which is healing. Healing from God can rid us of hurt and hostility and hate. Healing that God alone can bring. These things can destroy our relationship with God and cut us off from experiencing his hurt. But we need to pray, Lord, rid me of this hurt and hostility and hate, that I may not harm others, but I may know your healing. This is what we can see in Saul, that we can be freed of, that we can be healed of, as we refuse to harbour these things, as we come to God and say, Lord God, through Jesus Christ, I seek your healing in my life from these 5 H's of negative thought. Lord, may we not be like Saul. Let's change our focus and look at David. David is on the run. Sadly for David, change and healing doesn't happen. David has to run away. David, who has become Saul's son-in-law through marrying Michal, and become close friends with Jonathan. And Jonathan has got a promise from Saul not to harm David, but straight away Saul goes back on his promise and takes every opportunity to get rid of David. So by chapter 19, verse 10, David has fled from Saul's household with the help of Saul's son Jonathan and Saul's daughter Michal, and David never ever returns to Saul's household. What a soap opera this is. What a divided family. There's Saul And there's David and the people helping David, the Saul's son and Saul's daughter. What a gripping story of jealousy and rivalry. In the best soap opera tradition, families are united by heroism of love and then divided by hatred and violence. How much this highlights the human condition, how emotion has the power to turn someone into someone who seeks to kill others simply by being who he was. David incites Saul to jealousy and has no choice in the end other than to run away. I love this trick that Michal plays on Saul's soldiers, the old body in the bed trick. Put a lump in the bed and say, oh yeah, he's in bed. They go upstairs to find David in bed, pull back the covers. It's not David. It's a shape that they put in the bed with some hair on the top of it, pretending to be David. You see that in plays and you think, does that really happen? This is where it really happened. David's not there, but Michal's set it up to pretend David's there. If it hadn't been so tragic, it would be hilarious, I tell you. But this is what I want to say about David. There's one difference between Saul and David that the writer of these words chooses to highlight again and again, 3 times in chapter 18. Did you notice as we looked at chapter 18 that Jude read to us? 3 times it highlights something about David that it never says about Saul. These are the things. Verse 12. It says this: Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David and had departed from Saul. That's verse 12. The Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. Verse 12. Verse 14. In everything David did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. That's in verse 14, just 2 verses later. David had success. Why? Not because he was a better man or because he was younger or because he was stronger. No, David had great success because the Lord was with him, says the writer. And then again at the end of that chapter in verse 28, the Lord was with David. Not once or twice, but 3 times in that one chapter, the writer tells us that crucial piece of narrative. The Lord was with David. I mean, Saul and David really have got similar life stories. Both are chosen by the Lord from no special background and called to be leaders and kings. Both turn out to be courageous warriors. They both have victory in battle. They both acclaimed by the people and loved by the people of Israel. Saul becomes king. David is part of the royal household and will himself become king, has been anointed. But it's Saul who is jealous of David because David has great success. Because of this one big difference between them. David knew the favor of the Lord. Saul had been rejected by God, which had led him to living his life outside of God's favor. David knew God had chosen him and had a special future prepared for him. Saul knew that he had been chosen by God, but he had let God down. He had turned his back on God, and God's favor had been removed for him. So that key difference between them, particularly there in verse 14, in everything David did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. Chapter 18, verse 14. That's the key verse in these chapters. In everything David did, he had great success because he was strong? No. Because he was musical? No. Because he was young? No. Because the Lord was with him. So against those 5 H's of negative thoughts, this is the key to success, to live in the favor of God. The key to success is to live in the favor of God. Now, when we say that, I want us to be careful what we mean by success, because that word success is wrongly used. Because David didn't have it easy. He spent the next few years being chased by Saul and living a life of fear and of danger and of hardship. These words are so freely used these days: success, making it good, prosperity. But success doesn't mean an easy life in God's economy. Success doesn't mean wealth. Jesus lived a life of poverty and never promised his followers they would be rich or successful in the world's eyes. Jesus warned against a love of money. God does choose sometimes to prosper some people who are faithful to him, and he's good at providing work for the unemployed. But God's favor upon us doesn't promise us that we will be rich. Success doesn't mean popularity or fame, if that's what you're after, or seeing all our ambitions fulfilled. Many have followed Christ and served him successfully and served him faithfully, but have never known anything of fame or riches or the favor of the people around them. God might give us those things, but God's favor on us does not make those by any means sure. Success in God's purposes is life lived in a way that pleases God. That means that God's favor and God's joy is upon us. Jesus came to give us life, and life in all its fullness. All that the world offers, but not necessarily in the way that many people want the good things of this world. Knowing the favor of God in our lives is rewarding in a way that Saul actually recognized when he was jealous of David. Saul had all the wealth. Saul had all the power, but David had the real success because he knew the favor of God. God's favor is about our obedience to him, our devotion to him, seeking after God's will and purpose for our life, and going in the direction he wants us to go. That's the way to be a David and not a Saul. That's the way to be a real success. Yes, David had the crowds cheering after him, but that wasn't the sign of David being a successful person or to knowing that he was following the right path. It was knowing the favor of God on him. It was knowing that he was walking in the purposes and the ways of God. Two men, Saul and David. Saul is now fading out of the plans and purposes of God. David is becoming more in the purposes of God. Saul is becoming a victim of negative emotions, those 5 H's of negative emotions. David is walking in the purpose and favor of God. Lord, may we not be like Saul, but may we be like David, knowing the favor of God upon us.